And we are very pleased to have Kali Akuno speaking this evening. And it's my great honor as the communications manager for the Green Party of the United States to first introduce one of our Green Party national co-chairs, a member of the Green Party Steering Committee. Gloria Matera also happens to be one of my supervisors along with Hillary Kane, and it's been such an honor to work under her and Hillary for almost 2 years. And it's sad that as of tonight, with tonight's steering committee elections, that Gloria is being termed out of the steering committee. But I will always treasure the time working with her in that capacity, and I've worked with Gloria for many years and look forward to working with Gloria for many more years to come. So I'm pleased to hand the stage over live from Brooklyn, New York, Gloria Matera.
Thank you, Michael. Good evening, Green comrades. So we're at the top of the evening of the third day of this amazing gathering, and we have done some good and hard work together, raised some funds for the party, which, by the way, you can continue to do throughout our meeting and whenever you are able to. Earlier today, we imagined what we wanted our party to be like, and the variety of responses were a clear indication that we're committed to building a stronger, more robust party, because that is how we'll be part of tearing down a racist capitalist system to build a just, sustainable, and more equitable one. And our keynote speaker tonight is someone who will inspire us in this work. Kali Akuno is co-founder and organizer with Cooperation Jackson. Cooperation Jackson is a model in action of sustainable community development, economic democracy, and community ownership. I'm grateful that Kali and I move in the same radical circles of the solidarity economy and eco-socialism. I continue to learn from and be inspired by him. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce my fellow revolutionary, Kali Akuno.
Well, good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. I have to apologize. I really wanted to participate and be an advocate and to really push some things in this year's kind of discussion. But I've been battling some bulging discs for almost a year now. It'll be a year in August. That my doctors tell me that I acquired from actually sitting down too much during the pandemic and being on too many Zoom calls. I kid you not. So, was double pleasure to be here because I was in a little bit of pain earlier in the week and was telling Michael I was concerned that I wasn't going to be able to make it. So anytime I'm able to make it through, talk to people, fulfill my commitments, I appreciate it maybe even more so than most of you, because it means I'm able to do some of the things I want to do, and this is one of the critical things. So let me start off with that, just to lay out off the top where I am hoping and will argue that I think we need to go, and I'm putting myself in this equation and the party in trying to move it in this particular direction. I will just state unequivocally, just off the top, and then we can discuss and debate what that means. I would like to see us unequivocally, unabashedly, unashamedly becoming the party that champions the transition to eco-socialism in this country. And I think the path to us doing so, part of that has already been laid. Now, there's some reclaiming within that I think that needs to happen. And let me be clear on what I mean. I believe everyone here knows that the concept and the term of a Green New Deal came from this very institution, from this body. Now, there's iterations of it that have been out before, but that came from the Green Party. Now, it's been hijacked by some elements and forces within the Democratic Party, and they've stripped it down of much of its meaning, much of its content, and they've pretty much kind of left, a shell and a concept that, for the most part, you got right forces who are fighting it tooth and nail, and then you got liberal forces what you're trying to fill the content and the meaning of it to be really a kind of a presentation of a bunch of false solutions, from carbon trading to things that they're touting that will somehow be quote unquote carbon neutral, but in effect, what they're proposing is that we'll tweak a few things here, but keep doing things the way that we've been doing and the way they've been done the past several hundred years, and then we'll just maybe solarize it, or we'll maybe try to make some little adjustments so that it runs off of battery instead of running off of coal or running off of oil or some particular thing. But don't get it in any way twisted, that they are not talking about transferring the ownership so that these things are either publicly owned, publicly become public utilities, or changing the relations of how the resources, particularly a lot of the raw materials that are needed to build a lot of the transitional things that they're talking about. They're still talking about stripping indigenous communities, stripping, folks in the global South of their resources, still stripping communities here in the United States, indigenous and other communities in the United States of the similar things. So it's not really a transition. It's something that they're putting out there to distort and to confuse, I would argue. And the reclaiming piece is, taking that concept back and filling it with concrete meaning. That is one of the critical tasks I think that we have before us, and I would like to invite all of you to join. I think that there are some very specific things within all of our communities. Now, granted, how things are implemented are different from one community to another, but I think there's some general principles and some general concepts that we need to be applying to move some principle pieces forward. Now, this has to be done in terms of talking about principles. What I'm articulating, we need to be very much supporting a program of land back initiatives, particularly toward indigenous community, and being kind of front and center in that effort. We need to be having a serious conversation about restorative justice and reparations for all the communities that have historically been damaged by the system and how it's developed and rolled out, particularly in this country, the past 400 years. That needs to be kind of two cornerstone principles that need to be developed. And these things then need to be really shifted towards building grassroots forces that are engaged in what Gloria was talking about and where we're working together in building out new relations, right? And new systems of ownership that are collectively based, that are based upon establishing commons and common usage, and are based on principles and organizing programs and consumption programs that are about restoring our ecologies and our ecosystems rather than continue to kind of exploit them. And this is critical. I'm just laying it on some basic things. This is critical because I don't think it would be overstating it to say that the clock is really ticking on us. And I think the last couple of years have demonstrated that more, but 2021 is highlighting this, I think, as grave as any other year. If you just look at what's going on, what's transpired in the last month and a half with record-breaking temperatures up in the Pacific Northwest. Where the fire season is basically beginning in most of the West, and it's already the initial count of fires is already greater than it was in 2020, and that was pretty earth-shattering and devastating within itself. And if you listen to what Biden, and the established political forces are offering, there's a lot of talk in the here and now about their new infrastructure bill and making kind of green projects, as they designated, being a kind of core part of that and arguing for it. But again, if you really look at the core and at the heart of what they're doing, it's a bunch of false solutions. And it's a bunch of things which are basically intent on keeping, the corporate forces and the capital forces that control the economy now, just keeping them in control of the economy, and again, just tweaking a couple of different things. Totally unacceptable. And I think it's critical that forces like us, like our forces, both educate folks to the shortcomings of these proposals and programs, but more importantly, start building in our own communities the real kind of grassroots alternatives. That is how we're going to really build our base. And I think in through the extension of that, that is how we're going to build the political forces of the Green Party, right? In the long term, that is where I think our bread needs to be buttered, and is engaging in this work and pivoting it so that a lot of the things that are out there now, where there's been an explosion because of the pandemic about mutual aid work, there's been a steady and kind of consistent growth the last decade in the solidarity economy and the cooperative work, that we need to be engaging in those forces, and many of those include forces who are already in the Green Party. We need to be thinking about how to give that concrete political meaning and coherence and be able to move in a direction that pivots the political aim of transforming the economy and transforming society from below in this particular piece, and be very clear about what we're posing as the alternative, and speaking up for that, articulating it even when it's not that popular in our communities. But we definitely have to be posing it as a counter to the increasingly open kind of neo-fascist program being articulated from the right, and the in my view, almost equally dangerous perpetuation of neoliberalism that's being posed by the liberals, because those two things just feed each other. They're in a perpetual cycle of enabling each other. If nothing is really interjected that's going to pivot us and transition us in a new way, we're going to continue to kind of march down this path towards the right, which is becoming increasingly much more dangerous. Now, anybody who's listened to me or seen anything, I'm, for one, I don't think I'm overstating the case that I think this society is really headed towards a major internal conflict, if not civil war. And I'm not saying that to exaggerate. Been trying to warn people for much of the last 10 years about some of the ways in which the right has been growing and gaining strength, and how they were learning lessons, from taking more cues from the forces in the South, who've been using rhetoric and been using the posture and program that Trump kind of articulated and made national. That stuff has been, down in the Deep South and down in Mississippi where I'm at. That has been the program and kind of the course all along. And he just found a way to kind of really articulate that on the heels of the strength of the Tea Party movement, which many people thought was just going to remain a kind of fringe, isolated piece. And we were warning folks that know that that was something that was heavily supported by capital, which wound up being exposed, by their relationship to the forces in the Walton family and some of the other, kind of capital forces that were not only giving them a media platform in the form of Fox and other kind of outlets, but actually funding and underscoring that. So it was going to have life and it was going to have some reach. And very little was being done to counter that, but much more in the areas that we were at, folks trying to coddle it. And we were saying this is not something that can be coddled. It's something that has to be openly opposed, and real alternatives to it have to be, clearly and openly stated, and stated with conviction and courage. And we're starting to see some elements of that, but I still don't think it's bold enough yet. I still don't think it's loud enough yet. And I think this is an area and a role that we have to play going forward that would give us, I think, greater clarity, greater definition, and greater purpose moving forward, to really build something that can transform, this country and make it a place where all of us can be and want to be and feel it's safe to be. These are some critical pieces going forward, just given the nature of the contests and the conflicts that are happening in the here and now. Now, there's a bit of a formula. I'll end with this to try to make it practical that we've been trying to push and promote. And we call it the build and fight formula. This is Cooperation Jackson. And try to ground it in things that millions of people are already doing. But we have to find some critical ways to connect, right? And build a kind of connective tissue and glue to make these things really come to life and serve a broader political purpose. So what we saw, the first piece on that is engaging in mutual aid and not just looking at it as a practice to deal with a crisis response, but as a practice to kind of reorient folks outside of the neoliberal individualized socialization that we've been subjected to, in some degrees all of our life, but particularly the last 40 years. We have to counter that through practices of solidarity and being very intentful and mindful of that, particularly recognizing, if you want to look at it in some ways, I think we have to, if you want to look at what's going on with COVID-19 and the pandemic and the state's response to it, it's really been an experiment in how the state is going to deal with more aggravated crises, which we know are coming down the line, climate change. And if we're real about that, then they have failed, and they have failed miserably to be able to come up with a coherent program and be able to execution to be able to serve a public good and do public health, which means the onus has to be much more starting off in our communities, and that's where the mutual aid piece comes up. And what we saw, I would argue, in the beginning of 2020, March and April in particular, was an explosion of mutual aid efforts, which I found very heartening because it means that there's still, people still wanting to connect and protect each other and take care, heal and nurture each other. And that's something that we have to build and expand upon. And I think that has to be connected to other productive activities. So the second piece that we really highlight within that is building up our food sovereignty and food capacity work in all our communities. And remember, the critical thing is finding ways to connect these two things. And another thing that while we're highlighting this, that we saw also early on during the pandemic was a lot of small farmers in particular finding ways to directly go to communities and bypass a lot of the middlemen in markets and directly serve communities and build and be connected to food banks and other mutual aid networks. And I think that really pointed a critical way forward about how we can kind of transform all these different supply chains and value chains to make them something that actually serve, human need rather than just strictly for profit. And that kind of pointed a way, if only briefly, but it kind of highlighted that another way of doing things is both possible and practical, and people have experienced some elements of it in their lifetime. We need to highlight these particular things. The third thing that we really want to highlight within this program, and I'll just stick to the first three, is really when we originally put it up, we were calling cooperative economics, but we think it's more appropriate now, after some exchange and back and forth, to highlight it more as worker self-organization, right? Which covers all the different aspects of the solidarity economy, but also highlights the deepened connection of those who are struggling, as we witness, in Bessemer, which is right next door to us, in Amazon and in these kind of behemoths that have grown and are continuing to grow in the quote unquote new post-COVID economy, that we need to be very much connected and building links about how to re-articulate a new economy where all these things actually serve the people and become public utilities rather than something, that just enrich people like Bezos and allow them to take, I'm gonna steal a phrase from Gil Scott Heron, Whitey on the Moon, kind of private excursions up into outer space, where they're just spending, millions of dollars that could be used and redirected here on Earth to serve human needs. So these are some critical tasks and practical things that I think we would like to put out there as concepts that we would like to see folks organize around to be a base to really re-articulate how we can transform this party. And I think there's some particular roles that in elevating this and practicing this that the Green Party can play and needs to move. And that gets back to what I said, the starting shot is, I think we need to become the very, unabashed, unashamed party of eco-socialist transition in this country, and put that out and start arguing and organizing for it. So I'll end there. I went about 3 minutes over what I wanted to, so we can open it up for questions and answers.
Thank you. Please, if you'd like, talk about local actions or approaches you've done or taken successfully to counteract both the right wing and neoliberalism. I think more than one Green has commented that neoliberalism is the petri dish with which grows fascism. Sincere thanks.
Mm-hmm. Couple of questions. I'm writing stuff out.
Sure. Thank you, Michael. Kali, there was an example a couple of years ago where a small town in Florida literally spent municipal money to open up their own grocery store.
Grocery store. Yeah.
Yep, because the all the local ones had closed. I think that's a fantastic idea, and that certainly fits within what you were just talking about. So at some point, if you can elaborate on that, over.
Mm-hmm.
So in your book, you talked about how we could have a just society, and you also talked about this on Democracy Now! What would you say we should try to do? What would be the first step that you would do to make sure that we would have an equal society that you talked about and laid out in your book? Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So one more, then try to answer.
Okay, one more. So just bringing up the participants tab. All right. Margaret, you're unmuted. Margaret Elizabeth, you're unmuted, but we're not hearing you yet.
Got that. No, my fault. I apologize.
Okay.
Michael, thank you, Kali. I'd like you to elaborate, if you would, please, on the role of intersectionality in moving forward as a progressive, eco-socialist, left-based party. Thank you.
Great, Kali. Would you like to respond?
Sure. Well, thank everybody for these. I think it was Randy. I'm gonna start with that one first. I think it's a foundation piece. Kind of what is the next step, and the first step, I think, is the way you put it. All things being equal, changing the system of land tenure, land ownership, land possession in the United States would be the first place that I would start. Rearticulating our relationship with Indigenous people, and then rearticulating our relationship with owning something that owns us, actually, that we come out of, like the concept of owning a resource that gives you life and nurtures you, that you can somehow kind of quarantine off for your own kind of private use, is a concept which leads to all kind of troubles that we have experienced for a couple of thousand years, I would argue, but particularly the last couple of 100 years. That is where I would start. Now, that's the hardest place to start, given the framework that we live in, and given the historic reality of settler colonialism, which defines the United States. That's what this project is. And that's why I'm saying that if that is something that we could do, that's something that we need to do. We need to fight for that, because it rearticulates everything, right? If we have to come up with new systems and new ways of being that are based upon sharing resources and not private appropriation of resources, it'll rearticulate everything. So that's where I would start. Now, we have to work our way backwards into a lot of ways to kind of get there. And that, I think that leads to part of what your kind of question was. I would articulate kind of Amy, about, what kind of actions and things can be set up to counter, like neoliberalism and the neo-fascist stuff that is emerging. I will cite best, the things that the Black communities I've been born and raised in and lived in, pretty much all of my life, who've always faced some variant of this kind of flip of a coin, really. Solidarity is key. And being very clear on what your purpose is also key. Now, in the face of constantly having to confront various forms of white supremacy and white terror, the element of self-defense has always been a uniting force. You say within the Black community, Latino communities, in the face of that, indigenous communities. And that can be a guiding force. But then the trick really comes into beyond just being clear of what we're fighting against. What do we want to fight for? What do we want to build? And what do we want to transform? And that's the more confusing part. Because there's some of us who just want to be included in what is, but have a better stake or a better share of what already exists, not realizing or sometimes ignoring or discounting that what exists because of the system of exploitation and extraction that exists. And so if we want to join that means we join in the ranks of those who are perpetuating that. And we've always tried to argue that we need to be for a much more broader restorative program that tries to take care of the least of these, as to draw from the Christians out of our community, and those teachings that until those who are most excluded, most marginalized, most oppressed, kind of be put front and center and their issues and needs are addressed, you're always going to kind of miss or oversee something or perpetuate certain forms of discrimination, whether intentionally or unintentionally. And I think this hits on the piece around the role of intersectionality. That is where that kind of consciousness really comes in and is vital, right? And us always being mindful of where power is concentrated in all relationships and how it's used, right? And who it's used by, because, I'm not a big fan of Foucault, and I don't mean to get too theoretical or anything. Some of his work I have major problems with, but I do appreciate the part of the analysis. He says that, to a degree, power is everywhere. And it's how we utilize and how it's possessed and how it's used. And I've always taken that to mean that there's a certain level from his teaching and arguing that there's a certain level of agency all of us have and can yield. But we have to be mindful of it in certain scenarios. I have to be mindful of it as a hetero-identified male in certain spaces, right? And so, within the community of women or femmes, be mindful of my presence, be mindful of my tone, be mindful of my language, how I'm exercising the power to make sure it's not power over, but power with, because I don't want to dispossess myself of power, but I don't want to strip that of anybody else. The point of it is enhancing that and enhancing all of our agency. That to me is where I see intersectionality coming in a radical way. Is like, how do we be mindful of, ableism, sexism, heteropatriarchy, and utilize the counter to that as weapons to uplift and enable more agency for people, not as something to bar people down or exclude them in a number of different ways, again, whether it's conscious or unconscious. So to me, it's a critical tool that we have to utilize in our analysis of the world, and how do we engage challenging, confronting, and using power, what we have, and amassing it collectively and individually, to be able to transform the world and remake it in a way that we know we want it to be more just. So I think it's a critical piece that we use and try to incorporate in all of our work, within Cooperation Jackson. And that's a process. If anybody tells you they perfected that, they're lying to you, because it's going to take, some time and some critical undoing to learn all the different ways that we've learned to treat each other badly. In some of these systems, capitalism is a beast which is, more or less 400 or 500 years old. Patriarchy is one I would argue is much older than that, much more entrenched, much more subtle, but just as dangerous and just as deadly. And so it's going to take time to unlearn all of these different things. And I think we've been unlearning it in waves, right? The movements that have come have taught us this and challenged different things in waves. And I think we are fortunate to live in a time and a place where, in particular, queer analysis, transgender analysis is becoming much more central in certain spaces and places within the left. I know some people irk at that or shy away from it, but I think it's something worth embracing to highlight new ways and new knowledge and for us to uncover, kind of hidden truths that we need to be aware of to be better at what we do and what we want to do. And then the last thing, just in terms of David, there are some tools I would like to highlight, like the next systems project has some tools, I think, that are kind of centered around what municipalities can do to help kind of advance this kind of transition that we need. And I think there are a lot of things that can be done, but I would tell you from our experience in Jackson that don't think that the local fights won't be just as hard and heavy as the national or international fights. They will be, and to get yourself prepared for that. Because we come from an experience where I think we had organized enough folks, convinced enough people to vote some of our comrades into office. But then we ran into some of the same pieces around being able to hold them accountable and hold them true to the mission. So there's systems within systems that we have to develop in order to see these things through. That's one of the clear lessons that we've been learning from our experience in Jackson over the past 8 years. And it's an ongoing process. But I think some of this piece aims in the direction of where we want to go to transform ownership of the means of production from the bottom up. And to try to make as much as possible, put it in kind of a public domain or a commons domain. And those are not the exact same thing, but they are interrelated, and it's where we need to be pushing for in our view.
Thank you, Kali. We've got a couple questions that came in from the chat, and then I also see we have a attendee with a Zoom hand up. So one question from the chat was, paraphrasing a bit, for people who came into the Green Party in earlier waves of its development and came into the Green Party before the current rise in the prominence of democratic socialism and socialism in general and eco-socialism, for folks who came into their Green Party work and their eco-activism not really relating to socialism, what's your argument for why eco-socialism is the version of ecological wisdom that the Green Party should be embracing and forwarding now? So that's one question. And then I'm going to go to Nikhilananda in Hawaii. You are now unmuted. If you can ask your question to Kali.
Oh, thank you, Michael. Brilliant presentation, Kali. I'd like some concrete suggestions in collaborating with elected Democrats, elected progressive Democrats, who may not accept the entire Green Party universe yet are natural allies on many issues. The example you gave was your comments about relating to agriculture and farmers. We as Greens tend to condemn all Democrats as evil. And I see in Maui and Hawaii, too many people that are natural Greens have chosen to be Democrats. And we've had 2 Greens who changed parties to Democrats and got elected. And they were able to do things inside as elected officials. So thank you, Kali, for your brilliant analysis. Mahalo.
Okay, thank you, Nikhilananda. And another question we had coming from the chat, Nate asks, what you think about how we can make policy changes along the way to having our ideal proportions of office-holding Greens. So maybe some overlap between that and Nikhilananda's question in terms of as we get Greens in office, what can we do? And then also working with progressives or people who have some overlap in values who are in office who are not of the Green Party. So between those 3 questions, would you like to take those, Kali, or do you want me to take a few more?
Sure.
Okay, great. Go for it.
Those are some hard nuts to crack. So let's and where I think at different points in time when we've had a lot of variance and a lot of disagreement. So let me start with the kind of why eco-socialism now, right? Piece, because I think it will lead into the other ones. Let's go back, because part of the piece was about those who came in at an earlier period of time when some of the language and some of the concepts, may not have been in vogue. I would challenge and push back on that, actually. Like in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, if you recall, there was a new left movement, that had some strength, particularly in the 60s and early 70s, that wasn't shying away from a variant of socialism. I was, my parents were part of that. I think I grew up in the tail end of that and see myself as a product of that time and that period. So it wasn't like those discussions and those debates weren't present in and around the Green Party. What unfortunately I think emerged was folks wind up phrasing a lot of what they were hoping to construct, the future and the vision that they wanted to construct, outside of the narrow paradigm that it got us set up in this contest between the Soviet Union and the United States in particular. And one of the things that the United States did an excellent job of, and it's not like the Soviets kind of helped them out in this vein, was, they defined what was going on in the Soviet Union, the 2 of them, as being socialism. And folks who didn't want to follow that particular model oftentimes were stuck in a rut of, I want the common ownership, a promise by the socialist ideal. I want the equality. I want the broad democracy promised by the kind of socialist ideal, but I don't want to be associated with that and that language and both the political baggage that came with it. And let's be honest, the persecution that came with it from the United States, because we got to remember 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, and well until now, anything in this country kind of labeled socialism or socialist or communist, whatever, or anarchist, that's bad. It's like you don't want to touch that. You don't want to be associated. Most folks don't. And the Green Party emerged in a period where that was the dominant strand of trying to create an alternative that didn't fit in that paradigm, right? Was trying to move outside of it and was constantly trying to find ways to speak about those principles and those values and ideas without being trapped or ensnared in that. And I think, in all honesty, that put the Green in some binds. In the early phases, it closed it off from a number of different communities. It closed it off from a lot of, I can tell you directly because I was there and part of it, a lot of Black radical communities, folks who should have been natural allies, who were always kind of looking for to build and construct some kind of third party narrative. That has always been there. Much of like the Black radical left or the Chicana radical left, like these are forces who came out of primarily what we would call national informed, meaning that organizations that were primarily Chicano or primarily Black or sometimes exclusively Black, but they had adopted aspects, sometimes, letter to letter of kind of a Marxist framework, or particularly a Marxist-Leninist framework or some variant of that. But we're always trying to find very concrete and practical ways, to empower their communities and transform the society, which often led them, particularly by like the 1980s, it led a number of different forces into supporting the Jesse Jackson campaign. Jesse just filled a vacuum. Let's be clear in our historical analysis. He just filled a vacuum. And he did that twice. And then when something really independent looked like it could emerge in kind of the Rainbow Party emerging out of Rainbow Coalition, that's when he made his dead-end deal with the Democrats. My parents were, now I was a youth, was by that time a teenager for around the 88. And we had some hardcore debates. I grew up primarily in Los Angeles, not exclusively, but we had some hardcore debates around to what extent should people be involved in anything having to do with the Democratic Party. And my folks were folks who tried to support some of the programs that were being appropriated by Jesse and folks, many of which they helped start or relate to, under this kind of notion that we could flip some of those new forces that were engaged, flip them into independent, kind of autonomous activity and steer them away from the Democrats. I know that was my parents' kind of thought orientation on why they engaged at all. And truth be told, it didn't work, at least not in my view. Because most folks came with an expectation that they were building something that was going to lead, or in the way that was framed, it was going to lead to transformation primarily from within the system through elected officials. And I think the emphasis was wrong then, and to a certain extent is wrong now. This is why I'm trying to connect them. We are going to build our strength with a more long-term, I argue, long-term and strategic view of building our base and building our power outside of the arena of just trying to elect people to office, right? And that there's deeper relations around building kind of practical projects that express and envision and point the way forward, right, in the real and the concrete to the greatest extent possible. This is the vision of the new relations that are possible, that we want to see, that will enable us to live more fulfilled lives. Then we run it, once we have that, we know we're going to confront material limitations with the law. Then it makes more sense, I would argue, to be able to put forth folks from our base that emerge from our membership, emerge from these kind of education transformative projects that will be true to understanding I'm engaging in this process to try to affect society and law in this way, right? And without that orientation, I think we often, what I would say, like in Jackson, we put folks in office oftentimes who didn't have the concrete experience of trying to do that work on the ground and just understood it maybe, or said they understood it from an intellectual level or intellectual perspective. But once they're in office, once you're in office, and I'm saying this from being, I don't know if folks know this about me, but, I helped put, Chokwe Lumumba in office and some other people in office. Who were running under, the auspices of some kind of alternative to the Democratic Party. But oftentimes what in truth, like what was going on in Jackson was, there's the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which kind of has its own entity and basis of life coming from the struggles of the 1960s, growing out of, primarily the efforts of SNCC, but not exclusively. But it was a compromise wherein, folks didn't want to stray too far from the Democratic Party and be excluded from, I guess, ballot lines was one of the arguments. So that, the mass association with the D, as people call it in Mississippi, would still be there, and then didn't believe that the work had been done deeply enough to get people to consider independent or a green running. And I always argue that that was an incorrect view, and I still think it's an incorrect view. And it oftentimes, I think, speaks to the lack of imagination of our own forces than it does to the reality of where a lot of communities are at. But, I could say that in the Jackson context, because there was 20-something odd years or 30-something odd years of autonomous work that had already been developed, and folks knew us to be a force outside of the Democratic Party. The work had been done. So it wasn't just saying like something speculative. It was like, no, folks know that we don't mess with the Democrats. They already know that, they've been on that, right? And so there's no need for us to recourse to do it. Now, in our case, I would say, unfortunately, many people just thought that, and let me put it plainly, a lot of forces in our kind of broader coalition didn't want to break with kind of the black petty bourgeois forces in town, because that is who they were, right? And that is how they were best situated. And so they wanted to be associated with radical kind of left ideas and positionality to a degree, but they didn't want to leave the comfort of home, right? And so we needed to push them in a way that I think we suffer from not pushing them further away. And then some of our forces, truth be told, were under this notion that it was more important to be in office than it was to change the parameters of how both the game is played and what the program was. And I would argue and articulate that we need to be, going back, we need to be clear that in the long term, we have to have our own independent base, and that is built and has to be built by building programs and activities and campaigns that are not just limited to winning office. That needs to be like 10, 20% of what we do. The other 80% has to be involved in building these practical programs and building the base, and that's going to take time and a different type of concentrated energy, I think, to produce. Now, does that mean, to kind of answer the Nicolando part of your question, that we don't deal with the Democrats? No, I think that there are times and places where you, like in Jackson, for instance, there's no way that we can totally avoid the Democrats, not in our effort. But we make it known, particularly us trying to target the young folks in our community, that that's not set in stone, and it's not like some religious edict that you have to be a Democrat or you have to do that. There's many choices and many options, and I think we're winning that battle, right? But what enables us to win it, I think, for us to be in a position to win it, is that we also have the co-ops, we have the community land trust, we have the mutual aid work we're doing, the relief work we're doing. So it's practical, it's concrete, it's tangible, and people see that our practices align with our political aims in this particular way, and that's what's winning the battle. And I think that is being practical and concrete. That is what we're going to have to do, I think, all throughout this country. It won't look the same in every different, in every community, because conditions aren't the same, the communities aren't the same, the traditions aren't the same. But again, upholding those principles and that orientation is what I think we need to do with the long-term perspective of building the transformative force that we need.
Thank you, Kali. I see that Deborah has a hand up. Deborah, you are now unmuted.
Question, how do we stand our ground when the Democrats and the corporate media tries to discredit us? And how do we hold Democrats accountable?
Thank you, Deborah. I am going to tag a question onto that, and then we might need to wrap after that. So, Kali, the work that you described doing on the ground work, building that material base is inspiring and compelling. I kind of feel like the Green Party is like one of Darwin's finches on the Galapagos Islands. Like we have this beak that we've evolved towards like creating ballot lines, right? Petitioning, get on the ballot, running candidates. And that is through hard work, right? And years of struggle that we've developed that specific skill set. And we felt like that was something we could offer the left, is like, well, we've got these ballot lines around. That's a unique set of skills, as Liam Neeson and Taken might say. And so how would you advise state parties and green counties on the ground to take on this this focus that you're expressing about being involved in material work, which many Greens as individuals already are, but as an organization, the Green Party has not consistently.
Right, just really quick.
Yes, go for it.
Not as an organization.
Right.
Yeah, no. So this is, I think, the trick, in part that we have to figure out, because, some of the faces and names here I know, and it's good to see, and I know some of the work that people are involved in. But it's often involved in that not as Greens, like you might be a Green and show up there or be involved, but it's not something that's particularly generated by the party as a party project, right? Or allied or engaged in that way. It's kind of more individual, engaged in the solidarity, different types of solidarity economy work or union organizing work. So it's kind of an adjunct. It's something that we do as individuals, but it's not something that we do as a party. We need to re-articulate that, so we're coming with the full weight and the resources that's there. And it's going to require some transformation on the party's part to be clear about understanding what that means. But I think it's a critical piece that has to get done, right? And people just see, like you said, that particular set of uniqueness, those unique skills, that can be applied in other arenas, right? Because the effort, energy, and the type of organizing of building the contact list, building contacts, building relations, doing the type of canvassing and door knocking, that is applied to almost any other thing that you want to do. You have to tweak it here or there, but the one-on-ones, the building relationships, it's just a re-articulation of the skill for another arena. So it's not like that has to be surrendered. It just has to be enhanced and articulated, I think, in some new areas. And the piece is, I'm not saying to give up that work. It just shouldn't be the dominant thing I'm arguing, of what we do, but a long-term piece. And part of the reason why I'm arguing is that, look, we know that state after state, county after county, some more so than others, some worse than others, Greens qualified and they changed the goalposts, and you got to do it all over again. Right? And right now we are in a period where, the right, they are dug in, and they're well positioned to execute, transforming all, at least 34 of the 50 states' laws and making some of that permanent, that they're going to wind up winning. I mean, if Arizona and what just took place was in the precedent, and I think it is, a lot of what is the Republicans are pushing through around the voting laws. One of the courts already said what Arizona did is constitutional, it's legal. They can keep doing it. And so that's going to set a precedent. Georgia and Alabama, Mississippi, Texas already, following suit, Florida, so how, given that these goalposts are going to be changed in ways where those kind of bases or those precedents are not going to be kind of re-articulated, at least for like another 2 or 3 cycles, like there's going to have to be some work convincing those who voted those Republicans in, right? In a lot of those states, and we're talking about particularly white working class communities and white middle class communities, because in truth, it was more white middle class communities, the petty bourgeois communities that voted in Trump. White working class voters get blamed for that, but that's actually not the real truth. But that's another conversation to have at another time. But we got to win those folks over. And you're not just going to win them over by let's be real. We're not just going to win them over by coming to talk about the Green Party platform. We got to come in and try to figure out how do we deliver better goods and services in this community where we know poor people of all colors and races are struggling in this economy under these new contexts. We got to come up with practical solutions there. Once that's done, then you have a broader audience. And that's time and effort that's going to have to take to get that. And just focusing kind of in on the battle line experience is not going to get us there, comrades. I'm just, I think we need to be real about that in face of what you're saying, Deborah. Like, the Democrats' job is to crush us. Let's be clear about that. They don't want anything to the left of them existing at all, and they've never wanted it. Going back to, the compromise of 1877, they've never wanted that. So number one, I think we have to always be insulated with the fact that that is their job to shit on us and to attack us, to anticipate that and kind of fortify ourselves mentally around that. But I think there are ways in which you can kind of use that as to your strength. Like, one of the arguments that we've been using, going back to an earlier point, that I think highlights a practical thing that I think we kind of stumbled upon this. But, one of the things that we've been using to describe over the years to describe our program is that we are trying to practice and create economic democracy. Now, the smart, right-wing nut jobs, and there are a few of them in our areas, who read and study seriously. They know exactly what we're talking about when we use their language. What the bind is, whenever we've been in any public debate with them, is, okay, you say you're for democracy. How did democracy just get limited from the economic arena? When and how did that happen? Right? And if you're about limiting people's, overall democratic choices, how could you be against economic democracy? And it's kind of put them in a bind, like, either you're for democracy or you're not. Which one? Right? And we know you guys are not really for democracy. And it just highlights, when you bring these arguments up, it just highlights ways in which you're not by setting all these constraints and limitations. But I think it's this type of positionality in the type of arguments that we need to be using to win folks over, right? Which is not about some of the old, just purely kind of ideological debates, like we were talking about like the Soviet Union or et cetera, that we can go toe to toe with anybody about that. That's the history we all know and love. We don't shy away from it. But the practical thing, when folks come up with us, like, and we hear this a lot in Jackson by new forces that we encounter, it's like, well, we heard you guys were socialists, or we heard you guys, and we're like, well, yeah, we are that. But, but we're also about making sure people in this community are fed. Are you about that, or are you not about that? And then it just makes it practical. Well, I'm for people being fed, but I'm not for it in this particular way. Well, what particular way are you for? Because are you for just perpetually providing charity to people? Like you constantly giving things to people and making them dependent upon you? Or are you trying to, get into a place where people are able to provide these things for themselves, and we're providing it, collectively as a community? Those are debates almost nobody, they can either walk away and just be mad or frustrated, but they aren't able to articulate that it's against either the Christian principles that most of them have been reared up and grown up with, or the broader value around, the limitation of kind of the charity model, right? People quickly walk away and or either embrace it and say, I see what you mean. So, but it's creating a type of antagonism very intentionally, but one that's not about closing the folks off in our community who may walk away. Because for me, I know as an organizer, and this is because I exist in a scale that makes this possible, to be clear, Jackson's not that big, and you're going to see somebody again anyway. So next time we come around, engage them in a similar conversation, like, the mission of improving the quality of conditions still remains, whether you agree with me or not. So what can we do together that we can agree upon? Then it's a different discussion. I know where you stand, you know where I stand. Now let's figure out the collective solution to make this possible. That's the democratic practice, right? Which is beyond like the ideological debate that you were trying to have with me before. It's like, I still need to work with you to solve this problem. How are we going to solve it? So I think that's the way in which we got to try to make all of this practical and win folks over to our vision, our view, and our program.
Thank you, Kali. Do you have any final thoughts before we wrap up? You've been very generous with your time. Anything you'd like us to take a look for in terms of what you've got coming out and what Cooperation Jackson has coming out that Greens can support?
I'm working on some things that try to highlight this Build and Fight program. I really am trying to get folks out, and it's something message we're trying to do. So please be on the lookout for that and engage it when it comes out. And I think the other thing, just, I think that this next year and a half is going to be rough for us as Greens. And that's going to come from the Democrats. The Republicans lump us together with them anyway, but I think it's really going to become from them because they are in a desperate play right now. And they're going to need some scapegoats, to deal with the failures that they're going to run into with how they've tried to execute their program, particularly with the limitations that they knew they were going to have with the Senate, or just given its composition. So there's going to be a lot of bullying efforts towards us, but we need to be prepared for that and start articulating a clear program, that we're basing and engaging in these activities to kind of withstand that. I sadly do believe, that the Democrats are going to lose the House and the Senate again in 2022. And instead of us lamenting that, we have to find some way to kind of, fill the void and come with a real alternative that the Democrats never want to touch upon. Because there's a lot of folks out there who vote for them. And I can say this practically from things I've seen and witnessed and experienced in Mississippi, who vote for them just because they're tired of the lies and the bullshit from the Democratic Party, not because they believe in the Republican program, right? And we have to make clear distinctions around that and find ways to speak and reach out to people and build our base, with what we organize and find some way to redirect that discontent, which is only going to grow because the crisis economically is only going to continue to escalate. So that's it for me, y'all. A lot more to say, but in the interest of time, I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Everyone, I would love to and allow everyone to turn their video on and turn their mic on. And can we give, please, a big round of applause for Kali Akuno, everyone. Let's give it up for Kali Akuno, everybody. Thank you, everyone. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce to the stage the chair of the Green Party's annual National Meeting Committee, and who has been an amazing force in bringing together these last few days. And we have one more amazing day of this annual national meeting. So I would like to welcome Dee Taylor, if you are ready to speak and sign us off for the evening.
Yes, I am. And I want to make sure you can hear me because my internet is acting wonky.
We can hear you great.
Okay, good, because everybody's like really jerky on my screen. Yeah, so it's my pleasure to be able to thank Kali, first of all, on behalf of the A&M Committee and the Green Party for providing insight and inspiration and food for thought for our work ahead of us in the party. And as we continue analyzing our strengths and areas that we need to strengthen. And we appreciate your presence tonight and your time, especially with a bad back. Believe me, I know exactly what you're talking about. and for offering your contribution towards the work that we're doing. So, and I'm really appreciate everybody being here. We have a nice audience this evening. I hope that everybody has been able to participate in the workshops and the plenary sessions with our anti-oppression trainers. We have another day ahead of us with some a panel on diversity, intersectionality, and inclusion tomorrow, as well as sessions with Aaron and Georgia. We have our presidential debrief tomorrow, and so it's another full day of very meaningful content to inspire us to move forward with our work. So thank you, everyone. I hope you have a good evening. Get some rest, stay hydrated, and we'll see you again tomorrow.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a great night.